this last week, I had to run into downtown Portland to pick up something, and so I headed south across the I-205 bridge. And I noticed again, no matter how many times I've gone across that bridge, when I get halfway across, I just have to look up the river towards Mount Hood. It's just such a beautiful sight to see Mount Hood silhouetted against the sky, and you're beginning to see the hillsides, the cliffsides, the Columbia Gorge. But more than anything else, that water, that wide, beautiful expanse of water that's flowing through, it just fills me. During the course of my lifetime, I've been fortunate to almost always live in a city that's by water. So I grew up on the Puget Sound in Seattle, and my first church was in San Francisco along the ocean in San Francisco Bay. And even when I was going to seminary, that was in St. Louis, so I was right by the Mississippi. But I'm so glad, every week at least, to be able to see the broad waters of the Columbia moving down. And the reason that I thought of that as I was writing my sermon is that our Bible text this morning, the Old Testament and the Gospel lesson in particular, raised the question, what is it that fills us? What is it that sustains us and keeps us alive? And one of the ways that Scripture has of answering that question is it's the river of God's life moving through us and around us that keeps us alive. It's the river of God's presence. It's the river of God's love that fills us and carries us, and that's what keeps us alive. That question, what is it that keeps us alive, I think is the background of our text today, two stories of widows. The committee that years ago picked which lessons to read on which day very clearly picked the theme of widows today, because the Old Testament, two stories of widows who are incredibly generous. And it's because, I believe, they knew that ultimately they were filled by God's river of life, and so could be generous with others. The first lesson, you probably know the story, you've heard it many times. It's the story in the time of Elijah the prophet. Elijah lived 800 years before Jesus. So in the time of the ancient kingdom of Israel and Judah, Elijah was a prophet. As this story begins, it doesn't give you this detail, but as this story begins, he's on the run for his life. He has offended King Ahab. Elijah was a prophet in the time of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. Elijah had told the king very honestly what the king was not doing right. Ahab was a notorious, oppressive, and unjust king, and Elijah confronted him with that. And King Ahab didn't take the criticism particularly well. And so he told his servants to go and kill Elijah. And so Elijah was on the run for his life, and he left, and he headed north out of Israel up towards the area of Sidon, what today is Lebanon and Syria. And he went to a village of Zarephath, right on the coast of the Mediterranean, north of Tyre and Sidon. The problem was that they were having a huge drought in that area. It hadn't rained for months. The crops had all died, and so there was a famine. Nobody had any food. So Elijah gets to the house of a particular widow that God had directed him to, and first asks for water and then asks for just a little bit of bread. And that's where, as we've heard in the lesson today, that this very heartfelt and tragic explanation by the widow who said, "Sir, I'm just gathering a little bit of wood because I have a little bit of cornmeal in my house and I have a little bit of oil. I'm going to bake the last batch of bread that I can and share it with my son, and we'll eat it, and then we'll die. There's no more food. This is the last meal. We're going to die." And Elijah says to her, "Do not be afraid. Your meal and your oil will not run out. Please bake some bread for me and share it with me also, and you will continue to live by the power of God." And the woman trusts that promise. The woman trusts that God's river of life is actually there for her, and she bakes the bread and shares it. And sure enough, as the story goes on, it's a miracle. But for as long as the drought lasts, until the rains come and crops can be grown, each morning there's a little bit more flour in the woman's cupboard and a little bit more oil, and she keeps alive that way. Then we jump to the gospel lesson today. It's a much shorter lesson. It's just a brief moment. Jesus is at the temple in Jerusalem. and he's sitting sort of at the entryway to the temple, watching people put their offerings in it. In the text, they put their offerings in the treasury. What that means is they didn't take up offerings during their worship services. They had kind of a big bin, a big jar near the entryway that they called the treasury pot. And when people came in to worship, they would put their offerings in. And he saw very wealthy people, the leaders of the community, coming in and bringing in huge bags of money. Then this widow, another widow, comes in and puts in 2 coins, which together are worth 1 penny. And Jesus calls it to the attention of his disciples and says, look at this, look at this. There are many giving out of their abundance, but this widow has just given everything she had. So 2 stories of women who make an incredible sacrifice of what they had. And we could stop there and just use it as an object lesson in sacrificial love and being willing to sacrifice for people, and that is very important. They are incredible models to us. But if we just stop at the point of praising sacrifice, we only get halfway there. We haven't dug deep enough. Because sacrifice by itself will drain you dry. If you just are in a habit of giving, if you just are being convinced by the preacher or your family or somebody to just keep on giving, if that's all there is, it's a noble deed, but eventually you run out. Eventually you run dry. And so most of us in our right mind, if knowing that that's the outcome, we're not going to do it. At some point we're going to say, whoa, no more sacrifice. What's underneath this story is that the widows not only have the gift of sacrificial generosity, but they also knew what ultimately fills them, what ultimately sustains them. They had experienced stepping into the river of God's life, into the river of God's generosity, into the river of God's presence, and knew that it would keep flowing to them. Now, whether in life or in death, that generous river of life would keep flowing to them, and that's what sustained their generosity. That's what really enabled their generosity. And so the question comes for us today, what do we know of that river? How are we being filled by it? Or what is it that we try to fill our lives with? I was struck in the news this last week by another story of sacrificial generosity of people going beyond themselves. There was a story about people all over the country that are sending gifts and blankets and food to people on the East Coast and along the coast of New York and New Jersey who have lost their house and lost everything. And as we have too. Last week, many of you members put together your funds, and we collected $1,000 just that last week in special offerings that we'll be sending off, and we'll give you a chance to do that again today. But people from all over the country have been doing it. But the news story that caught my attention was that people from areas that recently experienced the same kind of disaster were going out of their way to send help to New York. And so a whole lot of people in New Orleans, for example, people who know what it's like to lose everything, who also have tasted the river of compassion when all the help came to New Orleans. People in New Orleans are really putting things together, food and blankets and technical people who can put the wire systems back together, coming up from New Orleans to New York and New Jersey. And then also from Joplin, Missouri. Remember the huge tornado that literally wiped out Joplin? There was an article that people in Joplin who are still living in FEMA trailers, people who don't even have their homes back yet, are collecting everything they can to send it to New Jersey and New York. They have stepped in the river of compassion. They know what that's like. They know what it's like when God's love comes to them through other people in concrete ways. And it's out of that they are full and generous in giving to others. And so today we're invited again to realize, whether we know it or not, that there is this huge river